Good morning, everybody. It's the day that you've been waiting for.
Morning.
It's Data Day with Dean. You got Jeff, you got Ryan. Let's get to it.
Let's go.
Welcome to the HPLS podcast. Live, relevant, and high performance information, conversations, and education weekly.
There she is, back at it. I told you she came for the number one spot. Good morning, Lisa. Hope you're doing well. Good morning, Dean. Tell us where you are this morning and why you got a nice little different background other than the normal
office. Yeah. I'm at DATCon, our DAT's user conference. It's our first one in a couple of years where we've got, I think, something like just over 200 brokers, about 60 shippers, bunch of carriers. So that's kind of fits DAT's, customer demographic, and it's predominantly broker focused. But it's our first conference in a couple of years. Very excited to get together. Today is Shipper Day. So nice. Those of you that will recall, a couple of years ago, we purchased the Freight Market Intelligence Consortium from Chainalytics, which brought in all of our shipper contract customers into DAT's network because we were primarily a spot market broker-focused business. But this brings in about $40 billion in contract freight spend. So today is all about shippers. And hopefully we'll learn a lot about what they're seeing as we head into the holiday season. As we were talking about off air, a lot to talk about, lots of inventories. I expect lots of good shopping bargains this year. Will be probably more the norm than last year when people are worried about not having anything at all.
Yeah, I remember like Halloween costumes, you can find them. And just before we kind of get into it, Dean, I know today's Shippers Day. If you want to, I don't know, if you want to put in a good word for Jeff and I, if they want to come on Tuesdays, get some shippers.
Yeah, there you go. That's a good one. There you go.
Yeah. Always be selling, right?
That's thinking, man. That's definitely thinking.
We asked, because we do our live show on Tuesdays with the exception of yesterday because of travel, but when we asked our shippers in a survey, a lot of them didn't know a lot about our Tuesday IQ show, which really came out of the pandemic. So, and it's interesting since we started to create the awareness with our shippers, the viewership started to increase. So we should do that. That's a good idea, right? I'll make sure.
No, I was just mentioning it as a joke, but hey, if we can capitalize on it, it would be awesome. Kind of get some more viewers on here because we're kind of seeing the value in it. So I know. Just let's get into it. Everybody wants to know what's going on with Hurricane Ian, the aftermath. I know Jeff has been daily. He's refreshing every day on his things. What's going on? So Dean, hit us with the data, brother.
Yeah, the thing we talked about in last week's show was, we sort of pontificated that, or certainly I did, that I didn't think that the hurricane would move the national needle in any significant way, like the polar vortex did in February last year. Didn't happen. Last week was end of month, end of quarter. So we typically see a bump in spot market volumes at the end of that last shipping week. So spot rates in dry van up sort of less than a penny per mile. Reefer was down about 3 cents. That's consistent with the cooling off in the produce season. Flatbed was down a few pennies. So yeah, that's sort of consistent with how we see the market. The story is very different though regionally, which of course is where the hurricane hit. One of the big freight markets in Florida, and in fact there's about 5, but the big one is Lakeland, the Lakeland freight market, which includes Orlando. It runs kind of right across the middle third of the country. So we saw a lot of impact on freight volumes there. One thing I did see that I thought was absolutely fascinating, and I hadn't really seen it to a large degree before, was the staging of freight was very evident last week in freight markets to the north. And of course, you guys would be involved in that quite a bit. But what we saw, so if you think about Florida, a lot of, Florida sort of starts around, the Panhandle and then Jacksonville and works its way down. But north of that in Montgomery, Tallahassee, Macon, Tifton, they're all sort of those southern Georgia, Alabama markets. Inbound spot market loads jumped 20% last week. After dropping considerably for the prior month. So it was really evident that a lot of freight was being staged in warehouses ahead of hurricane making landfall. Some of those volumes came from big distribution markets like Memphis. Memphis is sort of our logistics capital of the country, where you've got all those railroads and highways intersecting. Spot rates on that lane up 30 cents a mile last week over the September average. Atlanta's probably the largest distribution market in the southeast. Short haul rates to Tifton from Atlanta up $50 a load to 602. That's not a big jump, but they've been steadily decreasing for the last 10 months. So you can see that on some lanes, there was significant movement. Outbound line haul rates overall in Florida were up 7 cents a mile to $1.20. They've been dropping for the 3 weeks prior. So I don't think you'll see, I think you'll see more movement this week in rates as people start to move more freight in and out as the roads become more passable. Lakeland was the most impacted freight market. No surprise. That's where Ian made landfall. Outbound loads in Lakeland up 8 cents a mile, only $1.12 per mile, which really shows you how unbalanced that market is, because Florida is primarily a consumer market where most freight comes in compared to what goes out. A lot of freight moves Lakeland to Miami. Loads are up the cost of loads were up last week. Loads out of Jacksonville to Miami were up over about $100 over the September average. So lots of movement. I think that the two markets that supply a lot of freight for Florida in general, the two freight markets are Atlanta and Savannah. So rates from Atlanta and Savannah to Florida up 3 cents and 8 cents a mile respectively. So, and that's important to remember. Those rates have been decreasing for the 3 weeks prior. So it doesn't matter where I really look, I can see that the freight market was upended. Of course, that's not the most important thing that happened given the tragic loss of life, but there is imbalance. And what we typically see is happening. The outbound market will recover pretty quickly and stabilize, because it's sort of, there's not a lot of freight coming out of Florida at this time of the year. So rates will remain suppressed. The rates on the inbound side, for those of you that are selling capacity, that will remain elevated for quite some time. As we mentioned on the show last week, the reason they will remain impacted is because the deadhead component of getting back out of Florida has to be added into the inbound rate, because there's not a lot of freight coming out. Carriers that are running urgent loads, especially for FEMA, will be wanting to get back to those origin markets really, really quickly, because there's no loads to find anyway because of all the damage that's been done. So that's kind of our wrap up on Ian. But I think next week's show, next Wednesday, we'll have a better look at what the inbound market looks like. But I expect, just like every hurricane prior, inbound rates will remain elevated for somewhere in the order of 6 to 8 weeks based on our past data sets.
Yeah, talking about Florida, that I-4 corridor that goes right through Lakeland. I don't know, about 15 years ago, I opened up a Ford PDC down in Lakeland, and that's when they were starting to really boom on the commercial side, with a lot of DCs coming out of the woodworks and everything. What's really funny and very relative, the rates are going up on the flatbed and of course other modes. But my daughter was contacted by a hotshot guy, and I kind of blew my mind on this, because I know when FEMA calls up companies to help them move it, they don't care about the cost. They want to get those supplies in there ASAP, quick as possible. So the guy calls up my daughter and says, "Hey, listen, we need to get some portable showers down into the Fort Myers, Naples, that whole area down there. $2.36 a mile." Is like, what are you, nuts? I mean, that's unbelievable. It cost my daughter $950 in fuel and her diesel to go back and forth there. And this guy talking about gouging. I mean, gouging and raking people over the coals. And that's just one incident. There's other people down there. It's unfortunate that they do that kind of stuff. But it happens all the damn time, and it really pisses me off.
One thing I was talking to some guys on social media on Saturday, and he posted a picture of a load of cars, and these were used cars. And he said, "I'm Florida bound." And this is out of New Jersey. And I said, this is on Saturday morning. And I said, "Hold on, you're unloading in Florida already?" And he said, "Oh yeah, friends of mine were unloading yesterday." So that was Saturday. So literally that inbound market was like down for maybe 24 to 36 hours because they were rolling into there pretty quickly. I think because of some of those big interstates were largely unaffected, I think is how carriers have just sort of described it to me. It's a very different story when you get off the interstates. The other thing that was very important was in terms of freight being able to move was that a lot of the retail fuel outlets were largely unaffected. There were some closures, but in terms of getting diesel into your tanks, that was one thing that didn't manifest itself last week. So that allowed trucks to keep running. So the impact on oil markets was fairly muted, I think, is how the experts describe it, which is good news. The last thing we need is diesel shortages, trying to get supplies in.
Yeah, and it was just like John was saying yesterday, like with the CKE, was that they have like a response team, so they get prepared for things like this. And he said all but one store was unaffected, right? And they were able to kind of work their way and kind of go from there. So I think, Dean, with Florida, everyone kind of knows, like, the reason why I'm in Canada, I'm not in Florida, is because, hey, I'll take the snow over the hurricanes, right? But Dean, what are you kind of seeing in terms of them kind of bouncing back? Because you mentioned Atlanta coming back to Florida. I would assume, hey, Thanksgiving's coming up, Black Friday's coming up. We're going to see a surge. Thanksgiving is Monday in Canada. What are you kind of seeing as we kind of enter that Thanksgiving phase?
So in terms of just sort of national rates, is that
yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big unknown. Diesel prices are still coming down. That's probably the biggest single driver. The news, OPEC's meeting this week, the news that they're going to cut production is alarming. So because we want more production. So I think the single biggest driver of where rates go for everybody is the oil markets in particular. They're down another 3.5 cents this week to $4.89. The EIA is forecast. I had a look at it yesterday. EIA forecast has, and I'll just quickly pull this up. This time next year, the EIA is forecasting fuel to be at $4.11 per gallon. So that's a drop of about 67 cents. They're predicting $4.80 at the start of next year. So in January at $4.80, we're already close to that already. So I guess the answer to the question is, if diesel stayed the same as what it is now, we expect that spot rates have something like 2 to maybe 5 cents per mile still to go down before we see the seasonal effects you mentioned. Right. So think about Hurricane Ian made landfall. We've got a significant draw on capacity to move all these urgent loads. That didn't move the national rate needle, right? And so I think it's unlikely that Thanksgiving, Black Friday, Halloween, that inventory is already in warehouses. There won't be any additional pressure on capacity to move those loads. At an equipment level, though, there will be, especially refrigerated, right? So once you get to 3 weeks out from Thanksgiving, fresh turkeys start moving out of the Midwest. You'll see it'll be very, very hard to find a reefer van in the Midwest in particular. That's one market that really does see upward rate pressure right through to Thanksgiving. And then, of course, you're into, Christmas trees, and then you'll start to see, all the Christmas trees have to be in parking lots the day after Thanksgiving on that Monday. So that's when, if you're in the Pacific Northwest or up in the Canadian Maritimes or Northern Maine, there'll be a lot of volume, a lot of demand to move, things quickly. So I think that at an individual commodity and trailer type level, at a market level, there'll be some inflationary pressure on spot rates, but they're fairly normal seasonal things. I just don't see anything cataclysmic happening beyond diesel prices taking off again or plummeting. So, but I think the bigger thing though, Ryan, Jeff, is what happens next year, because it was kind of like deja vu, right? This time last year, there was all this kind of madness and panic about all the ships were backed up and could we get containers unloaded and all this, people talking about not having freight on shelves. It's a very different story this year, but underlying both years is supply chain disruptions. The market, there's still a lot of, I was reading something by Lars Jensen, the CEO of Vespucci Marine last week, and he said there's something like 4 million empty containers in the US right now above normal levels.
Wow.
And he said, what's 4 million containers? He said that's the entire southern border built into a container wall 8 high. So if you stack containers 8 high, it would go from Tijuana all the way across to Brownsville. And that's how many extra containers there are. So we've got a lot of supply chain disruption, and that's the difference this year. That's I think that once that and there's signs it's starting to ease. I think that's the point I'm trying to make is it's easing, even though the Port of New Jersey and New York is now starting to impose charges on ocean carriers if they're not picking up their empties. And of course, they're blanking sailings and reducing capacity because rates are dropping. They're trying to manipulate the spot rate there. So but once you get into when the pressure goes off in January, like it did this January, then if you remember, everybody kind of breathed a sigh of relief. But then rates started to tank. And this year, I expect rates to start to drop in Q1 as they normally do. We've been saying for most of the year that we expect the bottom of this freight cycle to be in Q1. And there is talk of a recession. Paul Bingham from his IHS Markit JSC's leading economist said at the JSC event last week that, yes, there will be a strict definition met of 2 successive declines in GDP, 2 quarters. But he said it'll be very shallow, was what he said. And I thought that was a particularly interesting, is that it'll be a shallow, short-lived drop, and then we'll return to fairly normal market economics once we get into the middle of the year. So I took a lot of comfort in that. But as we've been saying on the show here, the first quarter is going to be pretty tough, I think, for carriers because demand normally falls away. Shippers will continue to have pricing power all the way through then. The other part to remember is that all of the rates that are being negotiated now with the RFPs will be in routing guides at the start of the year. So I think contract freight market will be pretty healthy for carriers. I think there'll still be excess capacity. That's going to be the one data point I'm watching is how capacity is regulated through order cancellations, because we've got a lot of new orders trying to get out of factories. That's easing. They are improving the flow of trucks out of factories. Large fleets are trying to offload higher mileage used trucks because they've had to keep them longer during the pandemic. That'll keep used truck prices coming down. But the one thing that happened in 18 to 19, you'll remember, was order cancellations. And that, to me, that's a really good indicator of how confident or not large carriers are of the future, demand for their services. And so cancellations are going to be absolutely critical. Luckily, we've just signed an agreement with ACT Research, who are the dominant player in the used truck and trailer and new truck and trailer order space. ACT Research is just, we're starting to get some of their data in. So we'll be able to report what's happening on the new order front with a lot more accuracy on future shows. And we probably should get Tim DeNoyer on this show at some point. He's speaking here today at DatCon, but he's like a really good, sort of macroeconomist. He's a really good economist in the trucking industry, and he's got some good data points that can help figure out what next year is going to look like. So that's one data point I'm watching, but Q1 is definitely going to be, I think, for carriers in the spot market, pretty rough. And it could see some more capacity struggle to survive. But strangely enough, we're still adding capacity. We've just added another 9,000 carriers in August, something like 30,000 trucks, some of them hot shots, Ryan, Jeff, some of them large sleeper cab tractor trailers. So the market is still adding capacity, which is really strange to me. In a market like this, it's almost reminiscent of 2018 when the market turned. Everybody's putting in record orders for trucks and trailers. And of course, I was saying, along with a few other people, what are they looking at? The market's tanking. And of course, that was the start of the 2019 freight cycle.
Yeah, that's that's unfortunate. But boy, I can say that I was definitely wrong. I thought back in the beginning of this year when we were talking about all the congestion and the disruptions, we thought it was going to really be havoc this quarter.
Right. Yeah, so did I.
Thank God it went the other way. I mean, when you think about it, but the shift of going from LALB into the Houston market, into Savannah, into New York is self-evident. You can see that happening. And now they're having those type of issues that LA and LB had. And it's just shifting from the west to the east, So, I mean, we're not out of it yet. I mean, by far. And now they're just trying to find not just the capacity, but the warehouse space to put all this, product in, and to to what you said earlier, with all this extra product with Halloween coming up and Thanksgiving, think about all the products that came in late after the season last year because of the disruptions. You would think that they're going to have mass discounts on these products, as long as they don't say 2021 on them, right? Right. I think there's going to be a huge dump. I don't know what you think, Dean, but I think there's going to be a huge dump. They have to make spaces in these warehouses. They have no choice.
And I think it's a little bit like as Dan talked about last year, when some of his shippers were looking to find any particular space they could to turn into warehouses. It's a bit different this year because a lot of the larger shippers are getting preference over the smaller ones who are looking for space. So it's not a level playing field for those people trying to find warehouse space. You talked about cycle times. One of the things that, there's a lot of warehouse demand, and I suspect some of it's inflated because there is this bloated inventory effect. I can't help but think that we end up with too much warehouse space at some point, just like we will end up with too many 53-foot trailers parked in truck stops like they are right now. Literally taking up parking spaces because they haven't got freight for them, some of the big retailers. But there was one data point that came out last week. Larry Gross, who's one of the really clever guys in the intermodal rail space, he said that domestic container cycle times had deteriorated from pre-pandemic levels of 2.3 loads per month. Right, so just think about that. So these are intermodal domestic 53-foot containers, 2.3 loads a month they do. It's down to 1.7 loads per month now. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it means that the intermodal industry has needed 35% more units to handle the same volume.
Wow.
And that is why we saw a lot more demand for truckload last year, because cycle times were way down because trucks are spending a lot of time on docks that didn't have a lot of people to unload them. Fast forward now, we've got the same problem, but it's because they haven't got space to unload the trailers. So ATBS reported on their webinar last week that revenue is up 26%, but miles are down 11% for owner operators. Why are miles down 11%? Yeah, increased dwell and cycle time. So
the thing, to get back to, you're talking about the warehouse space. Remember a few weeks back, and maybe a couple months, I mentioned this, that when I read that article that they said over the next 10 years that we're going to need 1 billion more space of warehouse space. Yeah. Is that going to come to fruition? I mean, based upon what you just said, I mean, is that just talk?
I just don't see it. Look at what's happened in the shipping industry, right? So the big shipping companies have been banking money for the last 18 months or so. And now, of course, the demand has fallen off. Air cargo volumes are decreasing, which is my first pulse of the global economy, is air cargo, because it's the most expensive. When people cut that, you know that there's a slowdown. But what they're doing is, they're blanking their sailings. So suddenly you're going to find a lot more excess capacity of ships parked. And then inevitably you'll see this scrapping, like the increase in vessels being scrapped, the older vessels that are less efficient. So we're back into that same cycle where there's excess capacity. And my biggest fear is for the trucking industry as we see that again next year. If demand continues to fall off because of our, the sort of this recession that we're engineering to try and take the heat out of the economy and bring it back to normal. I think we've got to take that bitter pill soon to get that out of the way. And but I fear that we'll end up with a lot of capacity early next year that just won't have a home. Now, that said, there's a lot of carriers that are doing particularly well. Like, even though diesel prices are high, they're doing really well. Like, so I don't get trapped up in the doom and gloom that a lot of the the clickbait media talk about, because carriers are still very profitable. They're still running even at line haul rates at about $1.90. My truck that I've been running that we talk about on every other show is at $1.99 per mile this week. And so, I'm about 10 cents off what average line haul rates are. But our top 50 lanes at DAT, they're running at $2.40 a mile. So the high volume lanes, your carriers are still doing really well in the spot market compared to, this time last year. They're still doing they're doing okay, even though diesel prices are high. So But I think the power only guys, as we've talked about before, they're the ones that are probably going to struggle the most. Their power only rates are up. It's very interesting. The average line haul, the average rate for power only is it's $2.17 a mile, according to the data from ATBS. And you'll recall for the longest time it was about $1.50. If you had a truck, and you wanted to tow someone else's trailer, it was like $1.50. Well, it's gone up. It was $1.78 a year ago, but it's gone up considerably because of diesel prices in the last little while.
Sure.
And that's why you've seen a lot of owner-operators just drop their trailers and go back to being leased onto a larger fleet, because you just can't justify, the rates don't pay for having your own authority, basically, and you need 48 cents a mile to do that.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So what is their real quick? What is the fuel percent of the line haul now? I mean, 25% is when you're going to be profitable. What is it running at now?
Yeah, it's like I did the math last week. It's over 40%, and that's just not sustainable.
It's not. I mean, we were talking about 35% not so long ago, and it's like, how long can they operate that way? They can't. I mean, it's impossible.
Well, fuel operating costs are up 21 cents a mile in the last year. 20 cents of that is just straight up diesel. All the other costs in terms of the inflationary cost of other things are kind of rounding errors when you think about fuel. Fuel is, the big number. Fuel is, in terms of percentage of my operating costs, it's 72 cents a mile. If it cost me $2 a mile to run a truck today, it was $1.78 a year ago. It's the same for all the large carriers. I think it's important whenever you're talking to purchasing, capacity, is that everybody's operating costs are up somewhere in the order of 20 to 25 cents a mile in the last year, and it's largely because of diesel, which is kind of why I hedged a bit, Ryan, when you asked me about what's the market look like. It's really going to be driven by how quickly diesel comes down. That's going to be the key. If it comes down to $4.11 this time next year, rates could drop another 20 cents per mile, and I'd still be breaking even. Right. So it's someone asked me that aren't carriers sort of hemorrhaging at the moment? I said no, because spot rates are still 20 cents a mile higher than where they would be in normal pre-pandemic years at $1.90 a mile for this time of the year. So it's kind of a wash when you think about costs are up, but rates are up compared to the norm.
And the other thing too is, and it's all relevant, when you're in the political season, things start changing because people want votes, and they start doing things, and everything starts coming down. And then after everything is said and done, I mean, it's fact, things start rising again. I mean, it's just part of, the cycle when you get into the political season. So who knows what's going to happen? I hope that the fuel continues to drop for all of us, but how far and when is it going to start going back up?
All right, I have to run, guys. I've got to get on stage. I've got to run downstairs. They're yelling at me via Slack.
Have a great event.
All right, I want to thank everybody for making this really quick. Dean, next week I actually want to get into, we won't get into today, but I definitely want to get into an inflation, because I feel in Canada that's a big one that we're talking about. But Dean, thank you so much. I know you're going to race down. So thank you everybody for watching. We're going to hit the replay again at 12 and 3. Feel free to subscribe, like, and comment, and see you guys tomorrow. Take care.
Have a great day, guys.
Centurion Trucking, our motto is people before profit. Today's market requires more transparency, consistency, and focus on what our clients need to win. Centurion Trucking and American Logistics are poised to help their clients achieve and surpass their targets. If you're looking for a team that honors your needs, dreams, and aspirations, then get a hold of Daman at American Logistics.